Hey everyone, I'm Frank and welcome to the Money Cup channel. I know you love conspiracy theories. Everyone on social media seems to enjoy them, adding their own little sprinkle of sugar, salt, or even some spice to theories shared by X or Y. Personally, I'm against them. But today I want to talk about who really runs the world. The financial world, the political world, the economic world, and so on. You're going to see that my view is probably quite different from yours. I don't believe the Bilderberg Group or the Club of Rome have such a significant influence over what happens in the financial and political financial world. I don't think Donald Trump or Joe Biden or whoever the future president of the US, France, the UK's Prime Minister or Germany's Chancellor may be, or even Putin, can decisively influence things. I believe there's one person with enormous power, but he's not even the richest man on the planet. He doesn't have even 10% of Elon Musk's, Warren Buffett's, or George Soros's wealth. This person owns a company that's worth around $170 billion, much less than the $3 trillion of Nvidia, Apple, Microsoft, or other big tech firms. Some of you may have heard of him, others may not have. His name is Larry Fink, and he's the CEO of BlackRock. So why is BlackRock so important? We're going to take a look at Larry Fink's story. At the age of 30, he landed a job at an American bank back in the 80s, the famous First Boston. At one point, First Boston ran into big trouble, merged with Credit Suisse, and eventually Credit Suisse First Boston was on the brink of bankruptcy before it was bought out by UBS. But back in the 80s, First Boston was one of the key players in the American banking scene, very active on Wall Street. And the 1980s were a time when interest rates were cut drastically after inflation peaked in '82, the stock market soared, and it all came crashing down with the infamous Black Monday in 1987. What was Larry Fink doing at First Boston? He was working with mortgage-backed securities, a term you might be familiar with. Yes, mortgage-backed securities are those financial products that the Federal Reserve buys, which are essentially bundles of mortgages. The Federal Reserve bought a ton of them in 2008 to bail out the financial system during the subprime crisis, and they bought even more during the pandemic. Now they need to sell them back into the market, since the Fed has about $13 trillion worth of money printed through this method. These mortgage-backed securities can involve not just mortgages, but government bonds, and so on. But first, what exactly is a bond? A bond is essentially a piece of paper where the government, or a corporation in some cases, borrows money from investors, guaranteeing a specific interest rate. The bond market is also known as the fixed income market, and this is where Larry Fink operated, issuing mortgage-backed securities. Here's how it worked. A bank loans money to someone, let's call him X, to buy a house. X either pays or doesn't pay his mortgage. If he doesn't, the bank takes the mortgage and sells it to someone else. Sound familiar? Today we see this happening with non-performing loans that get sold to debt collection agencies. You know the letters and calls you get about your house being up for auction if you don't pay up? That's coming from someone else, not the original bank. So Larry Fink was packaging up these mortgage-backed securities at First Boston, selling them to keep the cash flowing quickly. The bank didn't have to wait 10 or 20 years for the loan to be repaid. With the money from selling the securities, they could issue new loans, repackage those, and so on. It's part of what led to the rise of subprime mortgages and the disastrous 2008 crisis. Fink made some good money doing this and was highly regarded, until 1986, when he made a bad bet that interest rates would rise instead of continuing to fall. He lost First Boston $100 million. That might not sound like much now, but back then it was more than $1 billion in today's money. Sure, a bank like First Boston could survive a $100 million loss, but someone had to take the fall, and that was Larry. He was fired and decided it was time to switch gears. In 1986, things were looking up. He left just before the 1987 crash, which could have wiped him out completely. He met two guys from Lehman Brothers, Peter Peterson, and Stephen Schwartzman. They had started a firm managing investment funds called Blackstone, and eventually Fink joined forces with them. Why did they hire Larry after his $100 million loss? Because by 1986, he had a forward-thinking idea to use computers to analyze risks in financial markets. Back then, computers existed, but no one was really using them to calculate risks or make decisions for them. There was no AI and barely any sophisticated software like we had in the 90s. Microsoft wasn't around yet. Apple was just getting started, and personal computers weren't a thing. Larry's idea was to develop software that could simulate all kinds of scenarios, even impossible ones like market crashes or huge surges, and apply it to all the positions they took. That's how Aladdin was born. You should know that this program, Aladdin, is still in use today by BlackRock, and even the Federal Reserve when they issue and sell government bonds. Aladdin has come a long way since 1986. This software intrigued Peterson and Schwartzman, and they brought Larry on board. Together, they made good money with this system, surviving through the 1997 crisis and the Gulf War in '91. By the late 90s, they had managed to gather around $48 billion in assets under management, a pretty impressive sum for that time. With this capital, Larry applied another idea, which he would fully realize in 2009. BlackRock started to take off in 2009 and has grown exponentially ever since, not so much in terms of stock value, but in terms of assets under management. As of early 2024, BlackRock manages around $10 trillion in assets, half of the US GDP. And Larry? He was responsible for creating what we now know as ETFs. An ETF is essentially an index. Let's say you're an investor, but you don't have the time or money to buy individual stocks like Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, or AMD. An ETF bundles those stocks together and sells you a share of the bundle. But because that bundle is still expensive, they split it into smaller parts so you can buy a fraction for, say, $200, even though the whole bundle is worth $2,000. In a way, it's a form of tokenization before tokenization was even a thing. Speaking of tokenization, Larry Fink recently said that within the next 10 years, everything will be tokenized: U.S. debt, currencies, mortgages, real estate, banks, stocks, everything. But before we get to that, Larry was creating ETFs, making it easier for people to invest in entire sectors like artificial intelligence without buying individual stocks. You give your money to Larry and he buys the stocks for you. Even though you technically own a part of that stock, it's Larry who does the actual buying and managing. And that's where things get interesting. Even though you own that fraction of an ETF, you're not the one voting in shareholder meetings. Larry is. BlackRock owns between 5% and 10% of almost every major company in the world. So when you pay your electric bill, about 5% of it goes to BlackRock. If you bank with ING, Deutsche Bank, or almost any major institution, BlackRock holds a stake. But while the shares aren't technically Larry's, he's the one voting on them. It's like the world's earnings are shared among millions of people, but only one person gets to vote. Larry holds that power, and it's a way of taking the voting rights from millions of people who invested their own money but don't get a say. So how can Larry influence the world? Well, it's simple. Larry's so powerful that when the Federal Reserve has trouble with mortgage-backed securities or government bonds, they need to talk to Larry. He holds over $2 trillion in ETFs tied to government bonds. TLT. That's Larry's, and I recommend it to you too. Larry makes money off every move, every interest payment on TLT, and every action you take in the ETF market. Sure, there are competitors, but Larry is the biggest. Even Warren Buffett, Goldman Sachs, and Jamie Dimon call Larry when they need something. Back when Dimon bought Bear Stearns in 2009, he had to talk to Larry because Bear had over $500 million in toxic assets, and Larry was the only one who could package and sell them. Whenever someone buys something, they talk to Larry. So when we talk about Elon Musk buying Twitter for $50 billion or Warren Buffett with his $300 billion in stocks, Larry can put $1, $2, or even $5 trillion on the table at any time. When you're that powerful, both in liquidity and in voting shares, the entire world starts revolving around you. Larry's a modest guy. He doesn't flaunt it on TV or act flashy. BlackRock doesn't make obscene profits either. They made about $5.4 billion recently, a tiny sum compared to what they manage. Larry doesn't overcharge his clients. He helps them buy, sell, and even makes products for both long and short investors. Larry even creates ETFs that bet against the market, and these sell just as well. In the end, he's essentially playing both sides. Some clients are long, others are short, and Larry takes fees from everyone. But all the money stays with him. The idea that within 2 or 3 years BlackRock might manage $25 trillion, more than the US GDP, has a lot of people worried. What if Larry loses it? What if Larry starts selling off shares without his clients wanting to sell? And who controls Larry? You might say the SEC, well, the SEC, Moody's, and S&P were also overseeing Lehman Brothers, which had a AAA rating just 2 days before it filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on September 15th. The most important thing is that Larry doesn't lose his mind. Because if Larry ever says, "I'm out," or there's even the slightest rumor that BlackRock is in trouble, the entire financial world will collapse. I'm sorry to say it, but Larry is the prime example of what we criticized back in 2008. Too big to fail. Larry isn't just too big, he's gigantic. He won't collapse, but he could bring down the entire world with him. Let's hope that never happens. Now, feel free to comment with your own conspiracy theories. I'll tell you this, I've never met Larry personally. I've never spoken to him. He rarely gives interviews, and when he does, it's brief, like his recent comment that tokenization is the future of the world. What I want to tell you now is that the financial world, unfortunately, is in the hands of one man, Larry Fink and BlackRock. If they take care of us and your investments, you might profit. If not, 2008 could seem like a pleasant memory compared to what might happen if BlackRock and Larry ever run into problems. Good luck. Share your thoughts and conspiracy theories in the comments. I don't believe anyone put Larry in charge. He was just smart enough to give people what they wanted, and in doing so, he gained immense power. I think regulators and political leaders need to step in to make sure BlackRock's monopoly doesn't keep growing. Not only should it be broken up, but I think it needs much more regulation. Take care, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time on the Money Cup channel.